Yeah. Okay. Via, you can start.
Guest lecture on exercise physiology, Magister of Physical Education Pasca Sarjana, Universitas Negeri Semarang. Monday, May 17, 2021. Special guest lecture Associate Professor Fabian Lim, PhD, from Lekong Chian School of Medicine, Nanyang Technology University, Singapore. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dirjen Sport Science Faculty, the Vice Academic Associate, Profesor Dr. Mahalul Azam, the Sport Science Department, Assistant Profesor Sugiarto, MSc, Guest Lecture, Profesor Fabian Lim, Moderator Associate, Profesor Sri Sumartiningsih, PhD, and all participants. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon. I am Via Fitriani. It's a precious chance to be your master of ceremony on this special occasion, this lecture in exercise physiology. Alhamdulillah, today's Sport Science Department Evika UNES is a special event guest lecture in exercise physiology by Associate Professor Fabian
Stop dulu, Bu Titin.
under the thermoregulation and heat stroke part 2. The several agenda for
Via, ini di Magister of Physical Education. I think I already told you.
Oh, sorry, Miss.
Okay, Magister of Physical Education. So,
mungkin langsung Bu Titin aja, enggak apa-apa.
Oke.
Ya, enggak usah pakai pengantar.
Ya, saya bacakan susunan acaranya terlebih dahulu. Bagaimana?
Oke. Pripun, Bu? Langsung
aja, enggak apa-apa.
Oke. So, langsung aja. Opening speech to Mrs. Setio Rahayu. Yang tadi yang dibacakan.
Okay, thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Magister of Physical Education Graduate School Universitas Negeri Semarang. The Honorable Associate Professor Fabian Lim, PhD, from Lekong Chian School of Medicine, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, for all students of Magister Physical Education and for dear audience. Thank you very much for joining in this virtual lecture. This guest lecture is implemented in cooperation and collaboration Magister of Physical Education Graduate School Universitas Negeri Semarang, Indonesia, and Lekong Chian School of Medicine, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. The purpose of this guest lecture are to increase student knowledge about sport physiology or exercise physiology, strengthen of cooperation and collaboration, academic networking between UNES and NTU Singapore. We are proud to collaborate with Associate Professor Fabian Lim, PhD from NTU. Thank you for your collaboration with us. And thank you to Mrs. Sri Sumartiningsih, PhD, as the moderator in this guest lecture and for facilitating and being the contact person for this event. Thank you too for Professor Dr. Sugianto, Coordinator Doctoral Program, for Professor Dr. Tandio Rahayu, Dean of Faculty of Sport Science UNES, and for all lecture Physical Education Graduate School UNES. And thank you too for all audience and have a nice lecturing. And time back to moderator. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Associate Professor Setio Rahayu. And so we are going to directly to the visiting professor about the thermoregulation and heat stroke. So I would like to introduce again. He's a professor, Associate Professor Fabian Chin Leong Lim from Lee Kong Chian School of Medicine, Nanyang Technology University, Singapore. And he have so many high index of publication in Scopus, have 35 document in Scopus, also H index is 17 and the citation is 1,258. And here is Professor Fabian Chen Leong Lim. The time is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Rayu. Thank you, Professor Sumatining C. I know you as Tintin. Yeah. I hope it's not too late. If I can wish everybody Selamat Hari Raya Adil Fitri.
Thank you
in the
very
season.
much.
Yeah. I wish all of you happiness and peace and good health. May we all fight COVID together, and may we, all be protected from COVID. So thank you for having me back again. This is a part 2 of the lecture that I gave last week. So last week I spoke very much on the basic science of thermoregulation. Today I'm going to talk about 3 topics that are quite applied. One is in the area of heat acclimatization, and the second is on two types of heat injury that is the most common, heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Okay, so as per last lecture, I will stop in the middle because it's quite a lot of materials. I will stop every maybe 45 minutes or so for you to ask questions so that you don't forget the question that you want to ask by the time the lecture finishes. So let me share my slide. Can everyone see my slide? Is it okay? Yeah, that's good. Okay, so based on what we spoke about how the body manages heat, about the transfer of heat between the body and the environment, about the definition of heat stress and heat strain, and also about the difference between thermoregulation and thermotolerance, right? I want to now move into another topic called heat acclimatization, which is a very well-established method for us to help our body to adapt to working in the heat. Okay, so this is a process of heat conditioning through a period of daily exposure. So if you're doing heat acclimatization, remember that the exposure to heat stress has to be daily. How long, how frequent, and so on. That's what I'll be talking about in more detail in this slide. Okay. So if you expose someone to the heat daily, that means every day you do physical work in the heat for so many minutes, so many hours, your body will start to adapt to the heat from about 4th day onwards. After 4 days, you will see that the body begin to adapt to the heat. And that adaptation will continue to occur until about 10 to 14 days. And that is why most of the heat acclimatization programs, they don't go more than 14 days. People are trying to do heat acclimatization in 6, 8, or even 10 days, but nobody is trying to go beyond 14 days because beyond 14 days, the adaptation plateaus off and further exposure to heat stress doesn't yield further benefits. So if you're doing a heat acclimatization program for your, say, your soccer team, your sports team, you would want to have a for a period where the daily exposure to heat stress every day for so many minutes and so on for more than 4 days, but less than 14 days. And the effects of heat acclimatization is that two things. It enhances body temperature response. Remember, we said that there are two different concepts, right? Thermoregulation and yeah. The effects of heat acclimatization affects more thermoregulation. That means your body learn how to regulate body temperature better when you're performing physical work under the same condition. So the difference between before and after is that when you do the same physical work under the same condition, your temperature would be lower. And as a result of that, you're able to perform that physical work over a longer period of time. And if you go back to the graph that I showed in the last lecture about thermoregulation, this is exactly what we're saying. Because the temperature rises at a slower rate, you hit the temperature threshold at a later time when performing the same work under the same level of heat stress. Okay. I lost my screen.
Yes, the screen disappeared.
Okay,
Maybe you can again.
Yeah, I don't know what happened.
Oh, that's good.
Okay.
Now it's too small. Maybe yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
That's good.
So this method is very well established. It has been used since the 1960s. Actually, the first people to use it are the Africans, and they were the people who are working in the mining industries, and they use heat acclimatization as an intervention to reduce heat injury and to prolong work tolerance among the miners in the industry. And this was subsequently adapted for application in sports, in military, in firefighting services, or any kind of physical work that requires exposure to heat stress. Okay, and for those who are working in hot environment, military soldiers, for example, firefighting services, for example, this is quite a standard recommendation to have a period of heat acclimatization. In fact, the one that I designed for the Singapore Armed Forces, this is being done almost like maybe once or twice a year. Everybody will have a period of heat acclimatization. One of the things that's still not being used sufficiently is sports. You will see that heat acclimatization is actually a very good ergogenic aid. It enhances especially endurance performance. And this is something that coaches and exercise physiologists have not learned to use it to benefit sports performance yet. Yep. And it is something that can be easily implemented. You don't need expensive equipment. I will show you later the work that I'm doing in the field, especially for us living in the tropics. You can make use of the natural environment to achieve heat acclimatization. So there are two terms that are being used, and I just want to explain them now. Acclimatization refers to heat adaptation in the outdoor environment, in the natural environment. Acclimation refers to heat adaptation in an environmental chamber. And what you see over here, this is the environmental chamber I used to work in, that I do this kind of work in soldiers. Okay, so that's the difference between acclimatization and acclimation. Acclimatization is outdoor in a natural environment. Acclimation is indoor in an environmental chamber. So the physiological adaptations for heat acclimatizations are many. One is that, as I said, when you perform the same physical work under the same condition, the core temperature would be lower, okay? Because your body learned how to dissipate heat in a more effective way. The second thing, and in most cases, you will see a drop in resting core temperature as well. So you start your heat exposure at a lower core temperature. The third is an increase in VO2 max because it involves physical work. Part of the adaptation is also an increase in oxygen consumption because when you do work in the heat, as I said the last time, it puts stress on your cardiovascular system. And as a result of that, your heart also becomes stronger. you get a higher stroke volume. And because your stroke volume is increased, your heart rate is lower when you're performing the same physical work after a period of heat acclimatization. Remember, we spoke about plasma volume and blood volume. Yeah, it has been shown that with heat acclimatization, there's also a larger volume of blood, larger volume of plasma in central circulation. So in terms of storage, your blood has got more capacity to support sweating before you go into a state of dehydration. You sweat more and you start sweating earlier. And this is important because, as I said, sweating is the primary mechanism for heat dissipation, assuming that the sweat is being evaporated, right? If sweat is not evaporated, very little heat loss occurs. And the summation of that is that you are able to tolerate the same workload for a longer period of time. And that's what we call work tolerance, right? You are able to work longer before you go into a state of fatigue or exhaustion. There are some questions of whether does heat acclimatization promote the secretion or production of heat shock proteins. Heat shock proteins are proteins that are produced in the cells to protect the cells against a variety of stressors. And there's this class of heat shock proteins called HSP, heat shock protein 70 or 72, because of their molecular weight, 70, 72 kilodalton. That's been shown to be very effective in protecting the cells against heat stress. So through a period of heat acclimatization, there are some people who thinks that our cells also produces more heat shock proteins, but we are unable to prove that in humans. It's been shown in animals. In humans, we can't prove that, because to do that, you need to do things like muscle biopsies. You need to take a certain cellular samples from the body and test for heat shock proteins. But it's a possibility. I want to show you a small study that we did on military recruits. As you know, in Singapore, at 18 years old, all our young men serve military. And the first part of military recruit training is called BMT, or basic military training. This is when they go from being civilian to the early part of military training, right? And what we did was at the first week when they went in to basic military training, we took them in, put them through a heat stress test, and we look at their temperature response. And then at the end of the basic military training, we put them through another heat stress test. In fact, two. The first one is where the environmental temperature is 36 degrees. The second heat stress test is when environmental temperature is 40 degrees, okay? And then we put them through 8 days of heat acclimatization or acclimation, because it's done in the chamber. And we did a third heat stress test. So altogether, there were 3 heat stress tests. Let me show you the results. So these are the results. The first, this is their body temperature, core temperature. And this is the time when they walk on the treadmill, right? Usually at about 5.5 kilometers per hour. And when they're walking on the treadmill, they're wearing military uniform, carrying the basic load of a military soldier, wearing helmet and so on. So the first line you see is this is a baseline. This is in the first week of military training, as they undergo, when they're walking on the treadmill, under 36 degrees Celsius, body temperature went up from about 35.5 degrees, 37.5 degrees, and finished at about 38.6 degrees or so. Yep. After 10 weeks of basic military training, they came back and did the same test. You can see that the body has adapted to heat. And when they did the same work, the body temperature is linearly lower than before basic military training. Then we put them through 8 days of heat acclimation. They came to my laboratory every day for 8 days. And they walk on the treadmill for 1 to 2 hours. And again, we put them through a heat stress test. This is again at 36 degrees, when environmental chamber temperature 36 degrees. And you can see further adaptation has taken place. This shows you the effectiveness of heat acclimatization program. What about at 40 degrees, right? So this was the baseline response at 40 degrees Celsius. And after 8 days of heat acclimatization, this is the temperature response. When they came back 8 days later, to do the same heat stress test. I have a second study now that's ongoing. We are only at the very early part, and I have some very early pilot data. And the challenge with this study is that I'm trying to heat acclimatize them, not in the chamber, but in the outdoor. And because they work in shift, some of the heat acclimatization is done in the night. And this is the first time in the history of science that anyone is trying to do heat acclimatization in the night, right? So we do heat acclimatization in the day, and certain days when the night shift, we do the acclimatization at night. The second problem I have is that they perform their work doing this kind of uniform that allows very little heat dissipation. So even if the body is able to adapt, the heat may still be trapped inside because of the uniform that they wear and the helmet and so on. And so far we have done seven subjects and 5 control, and want to share with you some of the results. So this is the study design. After we were trying to recruit 30 in the heat acclimatization group, 30 in the control group, right? So at the start, both groups will do a heat stress test, and then the control group will go back to do their normal shift cycle without heat acclimatization. This group will do 12 days of heat acclimatization in the field. Of the 12 days, 6 days are done in the daytime, 6 days are done in the nighttime. At the end of the 12 days, both groups come back again for a heat stress test. And this is how the heat stress test is done. They are done in a chamber, and it's programmed to 33 degrees Celsius, 70% relative humidity. That's similar to the weather in Singapore, about afternoon weather in Singapore. And then the speed on the treadmill is about 4.5 kilometers per hour. They walk on a treadmill carrying a gas tank, like how they would when they're working. And they walk for 3 hours, 40 minutes of walk, 20 minutes rest, 40 minutes of walk, 20 minutes rest, 40 minutes of walk, 20 minutes rest. And this is how I measure the body temperature, the internal temperature. I mentioned to you last time about this ingestible sensor. So they swallow the thermometer the night before, and I'm able to read the temperature using a logger outside. This is how the 12 days look like. Now, I'm not saying this is the way everyone should do heat acclimatization. Every heat acclimatization would have to be designed to suit the purpose of your acclimatization. So if you're acclimatizing someone for soccer, we have to design the program differently. You're acclimatizing someone for marathon, we have to design the program differently. So in this case, there's a 12-day program, and I divided into 3 phases: foundation phase, fitness heat adaptation phase, and ops-specific conditioning phase, right? And the activity ranges from just pure walking to circuit training, starting with 30 minutes per cycle, resting about 15 minutes at the end of each cycle, right, for 3 cycles, moving on to 40 minutes of work, resting 20 minutes for each cycle times 3 cycles. By the end of the 12 days, they should be able to walk for 3 hours in this kind of condition. Again, this is pilot results, so we do not know if this is the final one yet. So this is the control group. The blue line represents a heat stress test before the 12 days. And then 12 days later, the control group came back, did the same heat stress test. Just randomly, because of the numbers are very small, there are 5 of them only, we see a very slight drop in core temperature over here, about 0.2 degrees. Bear in mind, these people did not go through the heat acclimatization program. They are the control group. And this is the actual group, right? You see that the blue line again represents the baseline. At first cycle, they ended at 39. After 12 days of heat acclimatization, it dropped to 38.4. At the middle of second cycle, that's where most people couldn't tolerate the work anymore. They stopped at the baseline, that's 39.1. At the same time point, it dropped to 38.4. No change from this point, right? And in this case, after 12 days of heat acclimatization, they were able to go into the third cycle, whereas in the baseline, Everybody stopped at the middle of the second cycle. This is heart rate response. Again, there was some random adaptation that saw a slight drop in heart rate. This is in the control group. Blue line is baseline. The orange line is the after 12 days. This group did not go through heat acclimatization. And in the second cycle, that's where you see a slight difference in heart rate. But look at the heart rate change in the heat acclimatization group. At the end of the first cycle, in baseline was 171 beats per minute baseline. After 12 days, it dropped to about 150 beats per minute. At baseline, in the middle of second cycle, it was 183 beats per minute. After 12 days, at the same time point, it was 30 beats lower, meaning that the heart is actually stronger after 12 days of heat acclimatization. Not only the temperature has dropped, the cardiac output, the stroke volume has become higher so that the heart do not need to beat so many beats in order to deliver the same volume of blood to the muscles. Again, in this case, more of the subjects were able to, all the subjects in this case were able to complete the second cycle, and we have one subject who was able to go into the third cycle. This is work tolerance, right? Does that impact on how long you can work? So the blue bar, this is a heat acclimatization group. In the baseline, on the average, they could only work for an hour. After 12 days of heat acclimatization, they could work for up to 73 minutes. This is about 20-30% improvement in terms of work tolerance. In the control group, and baseline was 70 minutes. After 12 days, this group did not go through heat acclimatization. The work tolerance actually was lower, was reduced by about 20% to about 56 minutes. And so herein it summarizes for you the effectiveness of a simple program, right? All of you who are trained in sports science, you should have the skill sets to design a simple heat acclimatization program. It's very similar to a physical conditioning program, except that it has to be very graduated, and the maximum duration per exposure is about 2 hours. And that, for safety reason, you have to monitor their body temperature and so on throughout the day. But basically what I wanted to show you is something that's very practical. If you have a team that's going to be playing or competing in hot weather, or that hot weather is going to come, for example, if you're now in January, you know that May, June, July is going to be very hot. Your sports team should be undergoing heat acclimatization in February, March, or April even, so that by the time we come to May, they are already heat acclimatized to be able to tolerate the environmental heat more than if they were not acclimatized. Okay, so very simply, that is the information on heat acclimatization. I want to move on now to talk about heat injury. If you go to the textbook or most of the literature, most people would classify heat injury into 4 categories. The first is heat cramps. And this is where you get muscle cramps while you're working in the heat. Now, really, nobody really understands what is the mechanism. There are some people who attributed this to salt, the lack of salt, but there's very little scientific evidence to suggest that's the case. In fact, there's very little scientific evidence to suggest that there's a difference between muscle cramps in the heat and muscle cramps when the weather is not so hot, right? So essentially it's muscle cramps. Whether is it a heat injury is not been truly proven, okay? The second type of heat injury is what is known as heat syncope. And this is where you stand still, right? Like say you're in the military, you got to stand at sadia, stand at attention, right? And you stand for a long time, over a period of time, you find that people will start collapsing. And they call this heat syncope. But in reality, it is not a heat injury. What happens when you stand still and you don't move? When you stand still, there's no movement, there's no contraction at your lower body. And because of gravity, all the blood is being pulled at the lower body, at the lower limb. And because your muscles are not contracting, there's no pressure to pump the blood back to the heart. And this is what we call, orthostatic hypotension. In other words, your blood pressure starts to drop because of the effects of height and gravity. Okay? And over a period of time, you come to a point where the heart is not able to pump, to generate sufficient pressure to pump the blood back from the legs, from the lower limbs, back to the heart. And that's why it's a matter of time somebody will collapse. I believe the Indonesian military, you teach the soldiers the same thing. Over here, we teach the soldiers that when you stand at attention, when you stand at sadia, because you cannot move the body, right? You've got to be very disciplined. We teach the soldiers to wiggle their toes. Many people don't understand why is it that when I stand at sadia, I must wiggle my toes. The real reason is physiological. Because when you wiggle your toes, you move your toes, right? Like how I'm moving my fingers now. When you wiggle your toes, what are you doing? You are inducing muscle contraction. And when muscle contracts, it generates pressure to pump the blood back up. Remember this, your body has got two hearts, right? All the time we think that we only have one heart. No, actually we have two hearts. The first heart is the one that pumps the blood to the muscle. But the pumping of the pressure generated by the heart alone is not sufficient to return the blood against gravity back to the heart, especially when we're standing upright. So in order for blood to be returned back to our heart in a very efficient manner, we need a second pump in the body. And that second pump comes from muscle contraction. Okay? So when you're standing still and there's no muscle contraction, you get a syncope, right? Whether you're in the heat or you're not in the heat, you will still get a syncope. You're in the heat, maybe because of vasodilation, you get a syncope faster. But it is the same thing that will happen even when you're not in the heat, all right? So again, although heat cramps and heat syncope are classified as heat injury, they are not truly heat injuries, all right? They may happen more frequent when you're exercising in the heat, but the mechanism is not necessarily related to heat. The third type of heat injury is most common. It's called heat exhaustion. And this is when you're exercising quite hard, your body temperature goes up to relatively high, about 40 degrees or so. You feel drowsy, you feel headache or nauseous, meaning you want to vomit and throw up. And in some cases, the individual collapse. But most of the time, heat exhaustion is not life-threatening. After collapsing, when blood flow is regulated again, when blood flow starts to flow back to the heart, usually the person recover without any sequelae, without any permanent kind of consequences. And I'll be talking about this in more detail in a while, right? The last type of heat injury that's in the textbook is known as heat stroke. And this is the heat injury that is life-threatening, okay? It can kill, it can cause mental damage, can cause damage to the brain. So the first thing is that the body is hot, so there's hypothermia. Usually your body temperature, internal temperature is about 40.5 degrees or so. Now, the thing that differentiates heat stroke from other forms of heat injury is that you get mental disorientation. The brain becomes, the function of the brain becomes compromised, okay? So people who are having heat stroke, their behavior can be incoherent. They start to say things that you don't recognize. They start to say things that you don't understand, that they themselves don't understand even. Some of them start to lose direction. They are unable to orientate themselves to move towards a certain objective. They collapse most of the time. And then you lose the cognitive functions, you lose motor functions. So you may have loose bowels, loose bladders. Some cases go into coma. Some will die from it. Those who recover from it, in some cases, there are cognitive deficits, meaning that their memories may be compromised permanently. Their ability to do mathematics may be compromised. In some cases, they become depressive permanently. All right, so those are the different kind of heat injuries that you come across in the literature. And I won't talk about heat cramps and heat syncope anymore because I've already explained to you what they are. I want to go into a bit of detail and question the role of heat in the causation of heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Okay, so I'll start with heat exhaustion first, right? So this heat exhaustion usually occurs, of course, during physical activity, during physical exertion. And the thing to note is that for heat exhaustion, body temperature is not extremely high. It's between about 39.5 to about 40 degrees or so. And as I've explained to you previously, for a long time, we think that 40 degrees is dangerous. We now have lots of data, not just from me, from other people as well, to show that actually at this level, 39.5, 40 degrees, the body can tolerate this temperature very well. But this is a temperature range that heat exhaustion occurs at. And because it happens during physical activity, physical exertion, the source of heat is endogenous. Endogenous means that the heat is produced inside the body from metabolic heat. Because when you're active, you need to produce energy, and as part of the energy production, heat is being given out, as I've explained in my last lecture. And I've shown you data in the last lecture as well that that heat exhaustion can also occur in cool environment. And that is why I'm saying that it's not necessarily due to heat, right? And it affects anyone who's exposed to physical activity, not just in the heat, but hard, intensive physical activity for prolonged period of time. Now, one of the commonly misunderstood thing about heat exhaustion, and some of the textbook even write about this wrongly, is that heat exhaustion is the wrong thinking that heat exhaustion leads to heat stroke. That is wrong, all right? In the literature, it's very clear that this is wrong. The mechanisms for heat exhaustion is different from the mechanisms of heat stroke. Heat exhaustion in itself is not related to heat stroke, okay? And this has to be corrected in case this is what you're teaching. And you know, some of the textbooks, older textbooks that are saying this is wrong. Heat exhaustion does not precede heat stroke. Okay, so remember this is a separate category of heat injury that's not related to heat stroke, although in both cases, body temperature is higher than normal. So to understand the mechanisms of heat exhaustion, we need to come back to this diagram that I showed in my previous lecture about the effects of exercising in the heat or intense exercise that leads to a high body temperature, right? And we said that when you exercise in the heat, when you perform prolonged intense exercise, whether it's in a hard game of soccer, you run 10, 20 clicks, or even a marathon, this is what happened, right? you get an increase in metabolic heat production, and to a point where you are unable to, you produce more heat than the body can dissipate. And as a result of that, you get positive heat storage. Your body starts to store heat, your body temperature starts to go up. The third thing that happens is that because of the need to dissipate heat, we start to sweat, and we lose about 1 to 4 liters every hour of sweat, of fluid from the body in the form of sweat. Now, the net effect is that because the blood that flows to the muscles and out of the muscles, because of the need to remove heat, instead of going back to the heart, the blood has been diverted to the skin to induce sweating. So as a result of that, you get less blood going back to the heart. Because you get less blood going back to the heart, your left heart get less volume of blood to pump. As a result of that, you get a reduction in stroke volume. In order to maintain the cardiac output, heart rate has to increase to compensate for the drop in stroke volume so that cardiac output can be maintained, right? And so because of that, we say that muscles and skin compete for blood flow. The muscles need blood flow to produce energy, also to remove heat from muscle. The skin need blood flow to support sweating, right? And because of the need of the need for the heart to pump sufficient blood to meet the demands of the skin and the muscle, exercising in the heat adds more stress to the cardiovascular system. If you prolong doing this, at some point, performance will start to drop. You simply don't have enough blood to circulate around to pump sufficient blood to the muscle to produce the energy to sustain the performance. At the extreme case, you will just collapse, okay? Because you don't get enough blood going back to the heart, not enough blood going back to the brain, you just collapse. Now, this is one effect of it, but concurrently at the same time, there's a second effect. Because you're sweating 1 to 4 liters for every hour of activity, that fluid comes from the blood. That fluid comes from plasma and it comes from blood circulation, okay? And if you don't drink sufficient fluid, that adds to that at some point there will be a depletion of plasma volume, right? The volume of blood in the circulation becomes smaller, right? You get a decrease in blood volume. And as a result of that, not only you get blood being diverted to the skin, in the circulation itself, there'll be less blood to circulate around, and that adds to the problem. And herein this is the primary mechanism that causes heat exhaustion, right? So when we exercise, the demand for blood flow increases 5 times. And this is a simple diagram of what I just showed you earlier. When we're exercising, as I said, the body has got 2 hearts, right? The heart would need to pump blood to the muscle, and the muscles will need to pump blood back to the heart. And as long as this circuit continues to flow, your exercise will continue without any problem. But if you come to a point where either your heart is not able to pump sufficient blood to the muscle, or if your muscle is unable to return blood back to the heart, this is when, firstly, your exercise performance cannot be sustained, or at the extreme, you collapse because there's not enough blood going back to the brain, right? And there are 2 possible mechanisms why this can happen that is noted to be heat exhaustion. The first is that, again, is what I showed you just now. Because of high level of heat stress, you lose a large volume of sweat. And because you lose a large volume of sweat, you get lesser blood volume. At some point, your blood pressure drops, right? And that cannot sustain and you collapse. And that is known as heat exhaustion, okay? But there's a second mechanism how this can happen, right? And that mechanism has to do with overloading or training intensity. So remember this, during intense exercise, as I said, right, you get lots of blood being pushed to the lower body, right? So muscle fatigue because of blood pooling. At some point, the muscle goes into a state of fatigue because when the muscle is fatigued, it's unable to pump as much as it is supposed to pump. And because of that, there's a drop in force output. Because there's a drop in force output, you get a reduction in pressure in the lower limb. You get less blood coming back to the heart over here. And because of that, at some point, it's either your performance is unable to sustain, you have to stop, or you continue, then you collapse. And this is typically what happens during heat exhaustion. So what is important for you to note is this, that the key mechanism of heat exhaustion is not heat. So if you're trying to prevent heat exhaustion by keeping the body cool, by training in the cooler hour, but if you don't take care of your rehydration, your blood volume, you don't take care of your training load, right? You still cannot prevent heat exhaustion, okay? And this is why the teaching in the literature is very confusing, because heat exhaustion happens more frequently when the weather is hot, and naturally so, because when the weather is hot, what happens? We sweat more, right? It becomes more, there's more stress on the cardiovascular system. But because it happens when the weather is hot, uh, the science naturally attribute it to heat and to hot weather. But if you look at the body temperature of people with heat exhaustion, it is within a level that's very friendly, that's still very well tolerable. Like I said, most of the time you play a game of soccer on a hot day, your temperature will be 39, 40 degrees. If you run a 10, 20 kilometers race, the temperature will be 39, 40 degrees or so. Okay? And therefore, the thing you need to think about when you're trying to prevent heat exhaustion is this circuit over here. How to maintain blood circulation over here. And that goes back to this diagram that I showed you just now. Okay. There's a second diagram that followed this in my last lecture. So you can refer to my previous lecture on the effects of rehydration. All right. I'm going to show you some evidence to back this up. Again, this is the very early research I did and in soldiers, where I measured their core body temperature when they're doing military training. And I found that actually it's got not, in almost every time when I measure them, there are about 10% of them who have body temperature above 40 degrees. And none of them will have heat injury. And this is when I started to question whether heat injuries truly due to heat, or are there other mechanisms that are causing heat injury, right? And in the context of heat exhaustion, it is quite clear now that the primary mechanisms is a failure in blood circulation that can be perpetuated by heat, but it is not because the body is overheated, okay? Now, this is the number of heat injury cases in the Singapore Armed Forces for 20 years, right? 1990 to 2008. So in the early 1990s, we used to get about 160 to 200 cases a year. The red bars represent heat exhaustion. The blue bars represent heat stroke. And so sometime in 1993, 1994, we implemented a series of measures to prevent heat injury, right? We started getting them to make sure that they are properly hydrated, that they are training properly, and that they are training in cooler part of the day or so. And what you see is that over the 20 years, the number of heat cases have come down 90%, right? It's about 180, 200 cases here. And right now we are getting about 20 cases a year. But what is more important is for you to know that majority of the decrease in heat injury cases is due to the decrease in heat exhaustion, not due to the decrease in heat stroke, right? So things like hydration, things like training, having monitoring training intensity, having more graduated training progression itself helps to prevent heat exhaustion, for the similar reason that I explained to you earlier, because it reduces the demands, it reduces the stress on the cardiovascular system, not because the people becomes cooler. Okay, but I'm going to talk about the second part. Why is it that the heat stroke cases remain about the same? Okay, so over the 19 years, it remained about 5 to 12 cases of heat stroke in 16 of the 19 years. So the training control measures was not effective against heat stroke, but it was effective against heat exhaustion. Okay, so the underlying, so the thing to understand is that there's no implication that dehydration in itself is the main cause of heat stroke. Okay, maybe I'll talk about this in the second part. Okay, so very quickly, in case you're confused, what this study showed is this. They looked at the people who collapsed, 20 runners who collapsed and who were transported to hospital for heat injury. And this was in 2 different races in Canada, right? The blue dots shows you the volume of water they drank before the race. The red dot shows you the volume of water they drank during the race. Now, these are not very long races, 10 and 15-kilometer races, okay? And what the study showed is that whether you don't drink water before the race, or you drink up to 1.2 liters of water before the race, whether you don't drink water during the race or you drink up to about 600 mils of water during the race, it doesn't make a difference. You still collapse because of heat stroke. Not heat stroke, but heat exhaustion in this case, heat injury. But the common characteristics among these 20 runners wasn't because of the hydration, wasn't because of body temperature. All of them were novice runners, meaning they were running the race for the first time. And when they looked at the pace that they ran, all of them were running faster than they were trained to run. Remember the other mechanisms I talk about? Training overload. They collapse or heat injury not because of dehydration, not because their body temperature was high. They collapse or heat injury because they were running faster than they were trained to do. So the muscle wasn't able to pump blood back to the heart quick enough to sustain the range, the performance. So just to take home message before I move on to talk about heat stroke, all right? First is to understand that heat is a contributing factor, not the cause of heat exhaustion. That's the first point you need to understand, all right? The second point is that if you focus on controlling heat stress alone, it won't be effective in preventing heat exhaustion, and you give the people a false sense of security that they're being protected from heat exhaustion. And this in itself increases the risk of heat injury. Okay, so what do you do to prevent heat exhaustion? Firstly, have adequate hydration, but let me emphasize, not excessive. As I said the last time, your body can be mildly dehydrated during exercise, up to 2% of body weight loss. Very important, you match your training load with the ability of the people that you're training, that you're managing, right? And the progression of your training program in terms of volume and intensity has to be progressive so that you're able to cope. So when you're increasing training volume, when you're increasing training intensity, say they've been running 8 kilometers. Today, I want them to run 10 kilometers. What is important is during the first few periods of increment, you need to monitor them closer, right? And it's important to recognize this. Resting is as important as training. A lot of time coaches focus on training. They don't put enough focus on rest. I don't have time to go into this lecture, but if you go into the concept of compensation, it tells you that the period of adaptation is during the period of rest. The purpose of training is not to induce adaptation. The purpose of training is to induce a physiological deficit. And once the physiological deficit is induced, you need to rest in order for training adaptation to take place. So if you don't rest, you can train very hard. If you don't rest, the adaptation will not be optimal. Okay, I don't have enough time to go into this topic, but the main concept you should go with and your coaches should go with is that the rest is as important as the training. All right. The harder you train, the more you need to rest. That's the point. And you need to start to recognize the early signs of physical exhaustion. So if you look at the mechanism that I showed you just now, that is not really related to heat, it's more due to the failure of the blood circulation. Many of us, including myself, is saying that there's no such thing as heat exhaustion because it is not a heat injury. What happens when someone collapses? That's what we call heat exhaustion now. It is more physical exhaustion. Yeah, you're physically exhausted because you are demanding for more blood flow than your heart is able to supply. Okay? So I'm going to come back to you now. And maybe, shall we take question first? Yeah.
Okay. Actually, in here we have so many questions
Okay.
from registration. They this have a 100 question.
100.
uh, it's about the his stroke. And
Okay.
first they're asking, what is the signal when the people getting heat stroke and physical exhaustion, and what is the first aid? What must we do when they getting that to have first time
Yeah.
before we going to the hospital?
Okay. So I'm going to talk about heat stroke in the second hour. So I'll leave heat stroke out for now. So if you look at my earlier slide, heat exhaustion, typically they feel drowsy, they feel exhausted, they feel nauseous, they may feel like they're throwing out, they're dizzy, they can't walk straight, they're wobbly. Of course, their performance has dropped, and sometimes they collapse. Okay. So for someone who is got heat exhaustion, the first aid is to restore blood circulation. And how do you restore blood circulation? When they're lying down flat, right? You elevate their legs up about 1 foot, 1 to 2 foot, 1 foot to 2 feet up, so that blood flow will return back to the heart. Okay, so usually that's one of the first thing you do. Second thing is if they are conscious, then you should be able to feed them with water if they can take in water. All right, because sometimes they're vomiting. They can't even take in water even if you feed them. If you're able to feed them water, just feed them with water. Some people recommend cooling the body with fanning, with ice water. That is more for heat stroke than for heat exhaustion, but it is no harm doing that. It doesn't harm the body if you start to cool the body down even. Okay, so restoring blood circulation for heat exhaustion, restoring blood circulation by elevating the feet, rehydrating if they're conscious, if they're able to take in water, right? And if you want, you can cool the body if you want, of course. So these are the main first aid that you can do, before bring them to hospital. Usually, by the time once you restore circulation, they become conscious again, and as I said, it's usually not life-threatening, unless the person has got some other condition, like they have heart disease or something like that. Then it may lead to the trigger of a heart attack. Otherwise, for fit, healthy young individuals, heat exhaustion is usually not life-threatening. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, and then they're asking how to train the athlete to adaptation in the like
Yeah.
that you said before. You have like
Heat acclimatization.
heat acclimatization. How to do that?
So like I said, it's usually about 10 to 14 days. Some will do about 8 to 14 days. Every day, you're doing moderate exercises in the heat. Moderate, not high intensity exercise in the heat. The whole idea is to elevate body temperature. All right. You can start at about half an hour to about 45 minutes. Okay. And then over 10 to 14 days, increase that to about 1 to 2 hours. Increase gradually. Okay, so this about 10, so it's a very simple thing to do, right? It can be walking in the heat. So in the afternoon, you walk under the sun, or if you're training to perform better, you may do light running in the heat under the sun in the afternoon. Okay, but make sure they drink water. Okay, there's no need to restrict water, and you monitor their body temperature. How you monitor that? The simple thing to do is to do ear temperature. Okay, usually for safety reason, I will stop when the ear temperature is about 39 degrees or so, right? Because you can't see the temperature inside. Yeah. So these are the practical things you can do. Okay, so that, and then look out for early signs. When the person is unable to continue, don't force the person. When you start to, walk, you're unable to walk straight, the body is unable to maintain the posture. Goyang.
Yeah.
Those are the early signs that they are unable to tolerate the work. So you can stop. Even you haven't finished, never mind, just stop it. But 8 to 14 days, around there.
Wait a minute. And then this is have a question related that last you said about drinking during the game, during competition. That last time you said it's not too much because it's not good for your body. On the last lecture. So how to prevent the heat stroke or thermoregulation during competition, like when doing like football in the afternoon, they have a competition football and in the afternoon. So the athlete need to how to say, to adapt it.
Yeah. So
So
firstly, try to drink when you're thirsty. You know, don't feel thirsty when you're doing sports. That alone is enough to make sure you have enough fluid in the body. Secondly, as I said, if you're playing soccer and you're going to compete in the afternoon under hot condition, you should train your body to be able to perform under those conditions. So heat acclimatize, right? Start playing 30 minutes of soccer in the heat and drink sufficient water before and after that, right? And then extend that to 40 minutes, 45 minutes,
45
taking a
minutes.
longer break, taking half and the halftime break that you can, then come back to do a second round again. But not all at one go. You do that over 2 weeks or so. You start with 30 minutes, you go to about 40, 45 minutes, do 45 minutes for 3-4 days, right? Then you rest, you go a second cycle. Now, you don't go into a second cycle 45 minutes straight away. You go, when your second cycle, again, you start for 15 minutes. Then you go second cycle for 30 minutes, then second cycle for 45 minutes. You do that in the heat. Okay, so your body gets acclimatized over that 14 days. But fluid intake is important to prevent heat exhaustion and monitor their temperature at the ear.
Yeah. And the monitor the temperature we put into the ear, but in your studies, swallow, right?
Yeah, because
Swallow.
because in the field, it's not practical to be swallowing the sensor. Firstly, it's very expensive. It's about 100 US a pill.
Wow,
So you
expensive.
cannot be, it's not practical. That's more for research, right? So even now, when I do my heat acclimatization in the field, I don't use the ingestible sensor. I only use the ingestible sensor during the heat stress test when they are in the environmental chamber. But for the 12 days that they are in the field, I use ear temperature for practical reasons. Yeah. And because I use ear temperature, my threshold is lower because it's not as sensitive as the ingestible sensor. So that's why once it's 39 degrees, I will actually stop the individual, even though it's okay. He feels all right. Once it's 39 degrees, I will stop the person from continuing. Yeah. Because you can't see the real temperature. So that's how you make sure that you protect the person from excessive heat exposure.
And this is some asking about the temperature. Can use measure with the backhand? The backhand.
No, it's not
See
sensitive. Yeah, skin
sensitive.
temperature is influenced by the environment. So if it's under the sun, you'll be very hot. If it's under the shade, you'll be very cool. So skin temperature is not a good indicator of body temperature. Yeah. It's only useful in fever because in fever you can see a clear difference. But in normal exercise, skin temperature, hand, forehead, the cheek, it's not useful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not useful for the core. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And this is have any question from Ahmad Fajri? This is new question. You want asking directly? I think he's in Taipei now.
Oh, okay.
Okay. You want asking directly? Ahmad Fajri?
Hi.
Hello.
Yeah, I can
Hello.
see you. Hi.
Can you hear my voice?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity for the moderator. And then for Dr. Fabian Lim, I would like to ask about the dehydration, because some of the athletes may feel dehydrated during the game, but they don't really know when they get the dehydration. They just feels thirsty, but actually they are not dehydrated yet. But some of them actually they are dehydrated already, but they feel nothing during the performance. For example, on the soccer games, they have 45 minutes for one half of the soccer games, and then I would like to ask, when is the best time to take the water during the half? Maybe for 10 minutes, every 10 minutes they need to go to the side of the field to take the water, or something like that. Maybe you have the correct question, correct answer. That's for
Yeah,
my question. Thank you.
thank you. So as I said the last time, you shouldn't prescribe water intake by time. You shouldn't prescribe water intake by volume. Okay? Because everybody sweat differently. Everybody dehydrate differently. And the best indicator is your thirst, given by Mother Nature. So during sports, we can afford to dehydrate about 1 to 2% of body weight, right? So if you're 60 kilogram, you can afford to lose about 1.2 liters of water. Negative. Now, the simple guideline, the practical guideline is drink whenever you are thirsty. Drink when the body tells you to drink. That should be able to keep you within the level of hydration to maintain your performance. Okay, so use your thirst mechanism.
Okay. Thank you for the explanation,
Yeah.
Dr. Fabian Lim. And then maybe this the uh, last question. And then what kind of water should we take to rehydrate our body? Because some of the product they sell about, I think, several kind of drink water, such as Pocari Sweat, and then something like sport drink, something like that.
Yeah.
Or is that any required water to take?
Okay. For the purpose of hydration, just plain water is good enough. All right. To keep your body hydrated, just plain water is good enough. You only need sports drink if your duration of activity is very long and you need to replace energy. The purpose of sports drink is for energy replacement. It's not so much for water replacement. This is something that a lot of people don't realize. We drink sports drink to get the sugar because the
Uh,
body needs to replace the sugar, right? And this is if you're running a marathon, if you're playing soccer for, towards the end of your second half, you may need to drink, it may be useful to drink some of the sports drink in order to replace the sugar. But if you just want to be hydrated, just water is good enough.
okay, so because we need the glucose from the
Yeah.
sugar, and then maybe it's okay for us to take this water with sugar.
Yeah, it's
Sugar
okay.
and salt
Yeah,
together.
but again, the percentage has to be close to what the sports drink gives you, 6 to 8%. Because more than 6 to 8%, it can be counterproductive. It can draw water into your intestine instead. It can dehydrate you. Yeah. So the concentration of the salt and sugar should be quite close to what the sports drinks are giving you. Yeah. So it's about 6%, 8% of sugar. Yeah. If I
Okay.
think, yeah, 1
Thank you,
millimole is, yeah.
Dr.
And
Fabian
this,
Lim. Thank you for the
thank
moderator.
you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. And this is have from Professor Seno Aji Karjadi from Sport Coaching Science. He asking about when the athlete doing exercise, the body temperature usually increases. Is it possible when exercise the body temperature will be decreased? If possible, why could it happen?
It's only possible if you're in a very cold environment.
Mhm.
So if I'm exercising in winter, And if you go back to my last lecture where we talk about heat gain and heat loss, heat exchange,
Yes.
right? So metabolic heat is produced. And if you're in a cold weather, you get cold wind blowing, like you're cycling. If you're cycling and you know there's wind blowing against you, then that removes a lot of heat. So if you remove more heat than you're producing, then of course your body temperature will drop. But this is quite difficult in our kind of weather. Usually in our kind of weather, Indonesia, Singapore, because we're in the tropics, when we're active, usually we are producing more heat than the body can remove. So you get positive heat storage. I hope I answer your question. Yeah.
Yeah,
Unless
that's
you have
good.
a very specific condition that I'm not aware of. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Fabian Lim. So, for your information, in here also have your friend from Universitas Indonesia,
Okay.
and she's also the coach in the athletic,
Wonderful.
Professor Elmita Elias.
Oh, hi, Professor Imelda. Good to have
And
you here.
also have a Professor Hardian, and you got greeting from Professor Agus and Professor Hardian.
Hello, very
Ardian.
nice to see you again. Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you
this
for
is
being
Professor
here.
Elmita.
Nice to
Thank
see you.
Yes.
Nice to see you, Professor.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you for
Dr.
your
Ernita,
very
yeah.
kind
Yeah, Dr. Titin, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
lecture.
So today we don't have time to go into hydration because that's a separate topic altogether. I can just mention to you briefly. Yeah, but if you go to the YouTube video for the last lecture, I spoke a bit about hydration.
Okay, that's good. So continue maybe.
Okay, so we talk about heat stroke now.
Yes.
The one that killed. See if we can. Okay, let me do this. Yeah, okay. All right, so the next topic I want to go to is heat stroke. And in heat stroke, there are two types of heat stroke, okay? Exertional and classical. The difference is the source of heat. I just want to spend 2 minutes on classical heat stroke and then I'll move on to exertional heat stroke, which is more relevant to us. So classical heat stroke, as I said the last time, when our body exchanges heat with the environment, right? When the skin is warmer than the environment, the heat will flow from the skin to the environment. When the skin is cooler than the environment, the skin will absorb heat from the environment into the skin. Okay, so heat will flow from the warmer surface to the cooler surface. All right, so if my skin is 34, 36 degrees, if the environment is 38 degrees, I will be absorbing heat from the environment into the skin, and that goes into the body. If my skin is 34, 36, and the environment is 30 degrees, then heat will flow from my skin to the environment. All right, so very simple concept of heat flow down the temperature gradient. So classical heat stroke happens when the environmental temperature is high, okay, and the source of heat is exogenous, meaning it's from outside the body, it's from the environment itself, okay? So it's a condition when environmental temperature is higher than skin temperature. And when that happens, so if your skin is 34, 36, especially during a heat wave, environmental temperature can go up to 38, 40, sometimes 41 degrees or so. I showed some examples of it in my last lecture. When that happens, our skin absorbs heat from the environment, okay? And over time, heat will build up in our body because we absorb heat from the environment. The amount of heat in the body will start to store up, and body temperature can even go up to 40, 42, 43 degrees. In this kind of condition in the literature, the highest temperature recorded in the person is 46 degrees Celsius. So just sitting under the hot sun for a long period of time, you can be absorbing enough heat to increase body temperature to that level, okay? So other than the normal environment, there has been multiple cases of classical heat stroke in children and animals who are locked in the car on a hot day. So the dog owner or the parents, they put the children in the car, they wind up the window and they go and do shopping in the shopping center. And when they come back, they see that the child or the dog has already died or collapse or heat stroke, right? This is another instance. It's like an oven, you know, the sun will cook up the car, the air inside the car will start to heat up, and the hot air will transfer heat into the body. Okay, so these are classical heat stroke. Now, because the heat source is exogenous, usually, because the heat source is exogenous in classical heat stroke, the person is usually not active. You don't need to produce any energy. You're actually exposed to the hot sun in a passive manner. All right. Sometimes you perform, some people got to labor, you know, under the hot sun or so. And in the heat wave, the highest risk would be infants, toddlers, those who are elderly and frail, even psychiatric patients. Psychiatric patients will have an increase in classical heat stroke during a heat wave because of some of the medication that they are taking that is anticholinergic, right? And in older people in a heat wave, they get classical heat stroke secondary to the chronic illness because their body is not in good health. The body is not in good health, and that itself reduces their tolerance to heat, right? So this is essentially what classical heat stroke is a condition when our body absorbs enough heat from the environment to cause temperature to go up to a point that triggers heat stroke. I want to now talk about exertional heat stroke, which is, oh yeah, sorry. If you want to find out more about classical heat stroke and about what to do in a heat wave, these are two YouTube channels you can go into. Sometime in 2016, there was a heat wave in Malaysia, and Singapore also was having high temperature. I was interviewed in the news twice in the same week regarding what is heat wave and you know what should I do during a heat wave. They are on YouTube, and I put the address here. You can go in and look for it. Yeah. So I want to now talk about something that's more relevant to us, and that's exertional heat stroke, right? An exertional heat stroke, as the name suggests, takes place during physical exertion. And it occurs when the body temperature gets high during physical exertion. And because physical exertion, the source of heat is endogenous. It comes from within the body. As I said the last time, it will be metabolic heat. So even though you're in cold condition, if you exercise hard enough, you will produce enough heat to overheat the body. Okay? Usually the casualties body temperature is about 40.5 degrees, more than 40.5 degrees Celsius. And it can occur in cool environment because of endogenous heat. And these are the populations that are exposed to it. You know? Anyone who has to perform intense exercise for prolonged period of time or intense exercise in the outdoor are exposed to the risk of exertional heat stroke. Now, heat stroke has a very long history. In fact, it is few thousand years. The first case that we suspect to be reported of heat stroke is in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in the book of 2 Kings, when there was this Shunammite boy who was working in the field. He complained about having a headache and he collapsed and he died subsequently. Yeah, I can't remember the exact chapter, but it's in the book of 2 Kings in the Old Testament. The other records that we have of heat stroke happening comes from military history. And this happens in 24 BC when the Roman troops were in their expedition to Arabia and they were annihilated, meaning that they were killed. Majority of them were killed by what is described over here that we know today as heat stroke. And this is what they described. The malady was unlike any of the common complaint, but attacked the head and caused it to become parched, killing forthwith most of those who were attacked, right? And in the 12th century, this is, 1,200 years later, King Richard, in his crusade again, when they were fighting the Arabs for the Holy Land, again, he had his troop wiped out because of heat stroke, right? And they believed that it was because of the body armor that they were wearing. Closer to our time in World War I, the British Army was nearly defeated by the Turks near Mesopotamia. That would be in the area of Iraq now, again, because they suffered high casualty due to heat stroke. In the Six-Day War, between the Egyptian army and Israel. The Egyptian army suffered 20,000 deaths, which was believed to be due to heat stroke. In the literature, the publications about fluid intake, body temperature regulation, heat injury, heat stroke cases have been reported since the 1700s. So what I'm trying to bring across here is the fact that we know heat stroke for more than 300 years. And heat stroke has been reported more than 2,000 years ago. And I question, why is it that we are still having heat stroke today? All right. These are the heat stroke cases that happened in Singapore in the last 10 years or so. So this is a police reservist, who died just running a 2.4 kilometers run. Okay, 2.4 kilometers run in the fitness test. It takes about 10 to 12 minutes for a young man to run that distance. This was a recruit who was, had heat stroke, not during training. This was after his training, and he was going home, and he had to take a ferry to the mainland, and he collapsed during the ride in the ferry, and he died eventually of heat stroke. This was an Air Force trainee who died of heat stroke during the Jungle Confidence course. He was about very near to the end of this checkpoint. He collapsed and they couldn't resuscitate him. And we also have another case over here who died of heat stroke in 2018. So although heat stroke has been around for thousands of years, and there have been, many things written about heat stroke, the fact is that it still happens. And when it happens, it is very lethal. Lethal in the sense that, the consequence can be life-threatening. If not life-threatening, one can go into coma, and it's been reported that sometimes when you recover, there are mental deficits resulting from heat stroke permanently, right? And I want to go back to the understanding of heat stroke that is being practiced today, all right? And today, the way we teach heat stroke, the way we understand heat stroke, goes back to the model that has been taught about 100 years ago, okay? And this is the model that was published in 1924. And the way it explained heat stroke was that with heat stroke, you get excessive sweating, I explained to you earlier, when your body, because of that, you get a drop in blood volume. And because you don't get enough blood circulating in the body, the organs don't get enough blood supply. And therefore, the organs start to fail. And that's why in heat stroke, the difference between heat stroke and heat exhaustion is that, one, your brain is compromised. Secondly, you get multi-organ failure. The different organs in the body starts to fail. The liver, the kidney, the heart, and then eventually the brain starts to fail. And this was the explanation given by about heat stroke. The second one that came about that I could find was in 1946, published by Malamud. Malamud was a military surgeon, and he looked at the different heat stroke cases during World War II, and he came up with this explanation. Sorry, give me a second. And he came up with this explanation of heat stroke, that with excessive exposure to heat, you get the central mechanism for heat dissipation, meaning the brain itself, becomes incapacitated, right? He attributed it to the excessive heat causing the brain to be incapacitated in dissipating heat. And what that results in is that you stop sweating. And because you stop sweating, the body stores heat. It doesn't release heat. As a result of that, you go into circulatory shock, right? Internally, there's bleeding, and you go into circulatory shock, and your organs start to fail. And because your organ fail, your brain eventually fail, and you see the symptoms of heat stroke. We know now that this is not true, because it's been proven that heat stroke victims will continue to sweat. Okay, this idea that heat stroke victims don't sweat has been shown to be untrue. The point I'm trying to make is that till today, this is about 100 years later, we are still following the same thinking that was shown 100 years ago. Even though by following this, we're still seeing cases happening. People are still dying of heat stroke. So we are following something that's been taught to us, that's been shown not to work, but we're still continuing to teach this is the way heat stroke happens. And sometime in 1990, okay, and because it is heat related, right? The way we start to tell people to prevent heat injury is by what? To avoid heat, isn't it? To train or work in the shade, to monitor environmental heat stress, to acclimatize to heat, to drink lots of water, to rest and recover, wear light clothing, and things like that. Things that you do, everything that we do to prevent heat stroke is centered around heat. When it's been shown that by doing this, we still get heat stroke. Okay? So what else can be causing heat stroke if it is not due to heat? Right? Now, sometime in 1993, so if you look at a heat stroke patient, and this is from reports, pathological reports of heat stroke victims found in these 3 papers, which are quite classical. You see that the clinical presentation of a heat stroke victim is not that of a person who's overheated, but is that of a person who has got central infection called sepsis, right? So in a non-heat case, right, you get a bad infection like what we see in COVID now. They don't die of COVID, they die of sepsis, that the body go into central infection, basically. And when the body go into central infection, the body go into systemic inflammation, meaning that the whole body go into, the different parts of the body go into inflammation. And because one of the effects of inflammation is that the blood starts to clot. You don't get sufficient blood flowing to the different organs, and the organ starts to fail, all right? And so you get central nervous system disturbances. Necrosis is when you don't get enough blood flow. Disseminated intravascular coagulation refers to blood clot being spread all over the body. Septicemia would be contamination of the blood, right? Multi-organ failure. Hemorrhage would be bleeding, internal bleeding. Edema would be congestion and swelling because of water collection in different parts of the body. What you see in heat stroke victims is very similar to what you see in a patient who has sepsis in a hospital, right? Very similar kind of thing, meaning that it has to do with some form of an infection. And so on the early days, Carl Gisolfi and Hope Mosley, Hales and Sakurada, Bukama and Knockel, these are the 3 early papers to suggest that there's maybe the immune system is involved in the mechanisms of heat stroke, right? Because there's inflammation, it looks like an infection, that it has got something to do with the immune system. And they attribute it to bacteria in the intestine. Okay, I'll explain more about this in a while. When I had a chance to do my PhD and think about it longer, I came up with a new explanation of heat stroke, right? I call the dual pathway model of heat stroke. This is me, and that's my PhD supervisor. It's quite complicated. It will take me half a day to explain this to you, but I came up with a kindergarten version that I use for my seminars. And it was first published in 2006. And what this model suggests is that there are 2 different pathways to triggering heat stroke, all right? And that's why it's called the dual pathway model of heat stroke. And one of the key pathways is due to immune system disturbances, okay? And I'll explain that to you. So there are 2 pathways to heat stroke, right? The primary pathway takes place when core body temperature is lower than 42 degrees. Remember, in the last lecture, I showed you data that humans can tolerate up to 42 degrees if they're healthy, right, without any problem. And this happened at below 42 degrees. Heat stroke happened by what is called work or heat-induced endotoxemia. Endotoxemia refers to bacteria in the blood, okay? It comes from endotoxins. Endotoxins are a kind of bacteria, right? And when it's in the blood, it's called endotoxemia, when bacteria gets into the blood. So the first pathway has to do with bacteria appearing inside the blood. Okay, this is one. Secondly is when you have immune suppression, that your immune system is suppressed so that you cannot cope with the bacteria. Your body cannot remove the bacteria in the blood. And as a result of that, you go into a state of inflammation, you go into a state of sepsis, which explains the kind of symptoms or signs that you see in my previous slide. And if this is not the case, you exercise to a point where your body temperature goes above 42 degrees. Now, when temperature goes above 42 degrees, just by the heat alone, it can destroy the cells in the body, right? The cells can be disintegrated. Even without endotoxemia, the cells can be disintegrated. And when many cells get disintegrated, the organs can also fail. Okay? So basically, if this is your body temperature, up to the 42 degrees or so, endotoxemia, sepsis, and systemic inflammation would be the primary pathway, right? And if above 42 degrees, there'll be a second pathway, right? Where it's due to heat toxicity. When we say heat toxicity, we means due to the toxic effect of heat alone. High temperature alone can destroy the cells, okay? But it needs to be above 42 degrees in order for that to happen. I want to explain to you now how this mechanism of endotoxemia can happen. So when we are at rest, like what's happening to us now, all of us sitting down, we are not under stress. Within our intestine, there are lots of bacteria. There are millions and millions of bacteria. And there are good bacteria and there are bad bacteria. Okay, the bad bacteria is called gram-negative bacteria, or what is also known as lipopolysaccharides. Okay, there are a few names to it. One is endotoxins, lipopolysaccharides, which is LPS. But the bacteria cannot get into our blood circulation because the intestine barrier, the physical layer of the intestine, prevent the bacteria from crossing into the bloodstream. So the blood is aseptic, meaning the blood is clean. There's no bacteria in the blood. Okay, so this is what's happened with us now. All of us were sitting here assuming that we're healthy and there's no problem with our intestine. What happens during exercise? During exercise, our intestine doesn't withstand stress very well. Now, if you have to take an exam, if you're under stress, what do you feel in your stomach? You feel butterfly, right? That's the reaction of your intestine to stress. Our intestine doesn't withstand stress very well. And during exercise, the physical barrier, the permeability in the physical barrier of our intestine starts to open up. Okay? When it's exposed to heat and exercise, the permeability of our intestine starts to open up. When that permeability increases, bacteria from the intestine will leak into the blood circulation. And this is how we get endotoxins in the blood circulation during exercise. All right. But if our immune system is working well, not a problem. Your immune system will remove those endotoxins and you finish your exercise without any problem. However, if you're doing the same thing, the same person doing the same exercise on a different day, when the immune system is suppressed, meaning the immune system is not working so well, right? You do the same exercise. You're unable to remove the endotoxin. The amount of bacteria in the blood will increase to a point to trigger an infection, right? And when that happens, you get systemic inflammation, your organ starts to fail, your nervous system starts to fail, you get heat stroke. And this is why we call this heat intolerance. So whether you are heat tolerance here or your heat intolerance here depends on how well is your immune system, how strong is your intestinal barrier. Okay, and we know from the literature that if you're under a lot of stress, when you have work overload, meaning you're training and you're overtraining, or when you're training, when you're in a state of overtraining, all right, you can cause your immune system to be suppressed. when we're having a subclinical infection, meaning that you're having an infection but you do not know, you're still your body is fighting the infection. When you just recovered from a recent infection, when you're undergoing a long period of stress, mental stress, when you have poor nutrition for a long period of time, all this can suppress the immune system. Okay, and that is why, if you look at heat stroke victims, right, most of them, they have done the same training before without any problem. Why on a different day when they do the same training, they collapse of heat stroke? And that's because their immune system has been suppressed. And therefore, the key to protection from heat stroke, right, is not just the heat. It is also to protect the immune system. So I want to show you some data. This is what I've showed in my last lecture. The main message I want to show is this. So we monitored core temperature of 18 runners, and we divided them into fast runners, average, and slow runners. You see the red line is 40 degrees Celsius. Almost half of them have body temperature above 40 degrees Celsius. The highest is 41.7 degrees Celsius. None of them have heat stroke because their immune system was able to handle the bacteria that came into their blood circulation. We went back to the same marathon 3 years later to measure core temperature again, this time in 30 runners. And again, more than half of them have core temperature above 40 degrees. The highest was about 41 degrees. None of them have heat injury. But this time around, we did something else. We measured bacteria in the blood. Okay, we took blood before and after the half marathon. And this is the amount of bacteria that we discovered in the blood in 24 of the 30 runners. Yeah. Okay, anything from about 0.5 to about 8 picogram per mil of blood. And this is what we call mild endotoxemia. There was some bacteria in the blood, but it's at a very mild level that doesn't affect their health. Okay, and this is published by my honor student, another honor student in this journal over here. Yep. This is an animal study that I did, where after I sedated the animals, I did them in rats. I took the first blood sample, that's baseline. Then there are 4 groups of animals. There's a control group, okay? And there's a group where I injected turpentine into the hind limb muscle to induce inflammation. There's a third group where I injected dexamethasone. Dexamethasone is a steroid that suppresses inflammation. There's a fourth group where I injected both turpentine in the hind limb muscle plus dexamethasone plus steroid. After I injected them, I rested for 2 hours, and then half of each group were exposed to a heat stress up to 42 degrees for 15 minutes. Another half was not exposed to heat stress, but in both groups, I took blood sample at the same time point. When this group temperature reached 40 degrees, at the end of 42 degrees, 15 minutes, or when they died. And these are the results. Firstly, this is the survival. So in the control group, I had 65% survival, 35% died. In the turpentine group, I had about 75% survival, 25% died. Look at the group where I injected steroid that blocked inflammation, 100% survival. What about the group that had combination of turpentine and steroid? They have the highest death. I only had about 30% survival, so 70% died. Okay, so this is survival rate. This is the measurement of endotoxemia, the bacteria in the blood. So in the control group now, this is at rest. This is 2 hours after I injected the treatment. This is at 40 degrees body temperature. And this is at the last point when the body temperature is 42 degrees for 15 minutes. Right? In this group, you can see towards the end, there was a sharp increase in endotoxemia. Again, in this group injected with turpentine, the endotoxin level was quite stable up to 40 degrees, but when it went to 42 degrees, look, there was a sharp increase in endotoxin level. Look at this group. And this line is the control group, yeah? Same treatment, but no heat stress. Look at this group. Injected with steroid that block inflammation. No change in endotoxin level as well. And that is why 100% survived the heat stroke. Did not even have heat stroke. What about this group? The endotoxin level was quite low, just like this group because of the steroid, but towards the end, it went up, okay? And up to the level of about the same as resting level, but they had the highest level of death. So in these two groups, we know that they died due to endotoxemia, but why did this group in the animals, they died? You look at this indicator, that's AST. AST is aspartate transaminase. It's a liver enzyme that's indicative of tissue damage, okay? So as naturally, you see tissue damage in this group over here caused by the sepsis, tissue damage in this group caused by sepsis. In this group that survived 100%, no tissue damage at all. But look at this group, they had the highest death, and their AST level was the highest. That means that they died because of the second pathway of heat stroke. They died because of the toxicity of high temperature. Now, I measured different cytokines. Those of you who are familiar, I measured IL-1, IL-6, TNF alpha. They all showed the same thing. I'm just showing IL-1 beta here. They sharply increased, and they are indicators of inflammation. Okay, these are indicators of inflammation. And this is, again, in this group that survived, no increase at all. And in this group, there's also inflammation because of tissue damage. So here it goes. This is an experiment I did on animals that showed you the two pathways of heat stroke. My final data I want to show you is this. Now in heat stroke evidence, right, it's very hard to get data that are epidemiological because they don't happen very frequently. This is an epidemiological data coming from a military hospital in Thailand, where they collected the cases over 12 years, and from 1995 to 2007, and out of 28 patients. I just want to show you this part. Of the 28 patients, 27 or 96.4% reported to their colleagues about having low-grade fever for a few days before developing heat stroke. There we go. They had immune suppression, immune disturbances a few days before they had heat stroke. 4 of the 28, and these 4 will be part of the 27, or 14%, had a history of URI, upper respiratory tract infection, meaning that the body is already fighting an infection a few days before admission to hospital for heat stroke. 1 of them had history of diarrhea before the event, meaning that their intestine was really not working well. And this is, again, epidemiological proof to show to you that heat alone is not the cause of heat stroke. Your immune system, having a compromised immune system, is the key thing to having heat stroke in the first pathway of heat stroke. And so if you want to prevent heat stroke, you need to look at your lifestyle 2 weeks, 3 weeks before your key event, because your immune system don't get suppressed overnight. Your immune system gets suppressed over days, over weeks, right? To protect your immune system. And if you're trying to prevent heat stroke, don't just look at heat exposure. Look at the overall health of the individual. So the current model tells you that heat stroke is caused by heat when it's above 40, body temperature above 40 degrees. What I'm telling you is that it is due to heat stress plus immune disturbances. That's the trigger. The second difference is that currently you're taught that there's a static risk, there's a temperature threshold of 40 degrees, above which you start to get heat stroke. Now, if you look at the model I showed you, it is not necessarily the case. The same person can be able to tolerate the heat on one day. On a different day, when the immune system is suppressed, the same person can collapse or heat stroke. And this is what we call transient heat tolerance or transient heat intolerance, meaning that one day you can be tolerant, you can tolerate the heat. Another day you cannot tolerate the heat because your immune system have dropped, because there's a change in your state of physiology, right? And therefore, this makes it challenging to to prevent heat stroke. But the key is to make sure that everyone maintain a good state of health and not just look at everyone remain cool, right? And the final thing is the etiology. The current model teaches that heat stroke is due to heat stress, whereas what we're teaching in the dual pathway is due to accumulation of stress, because it is the accumulation of stress, the total stress load, including mental stress, that suppresses the immune system. And if you look at these changes, we need to look at our whole mental model, how we teach students, how we teach doctors to understand heat stroke and to prevent heat stroke, how our behavior need to change if we want to prevent heat stroke, right? So I'm not saying that all these measures are not useful. These are still useful, you still need to do, but this is not the most important thing. The most important thing is to maintain a good state of health. And there are three key things you need to do. Even we are training athletes, elite athletes, right? The more you need to look at this. Make sure you have adequate rest, make sure you have adequate sleep, and make sure you have good nutrition. These are the foundation of effective heat injury prevention to maintaining a good state of health. The higher your state of training, the higher your level of competition, the more this should apply to you, because you're exposing yourself to a very high degree of stress. And this is the way to prevent heat injury. Okay, and with that, I think I will end my talk. I hope you found this to be useful, and maybe a good time for us now to go back to Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Fabian Lim. That's very excellent presentation and this very wonderful knowledge. And this is have any question from Associate Professor Dr. Hadian from Universitas Diponegoro. Dr. Hadian is welcome.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor. Thank you, Dr. Titin. I have two questions, Professor. One is, we know that malignant hyperthermia is a abnormality of heat response due to polymorphism on RYR1 receptor gene. So during operation, when we apply halogen as an anesthetic, so it causes malignant hyperthermia. So in the case of your athlete and your military person that die due to hyperthermia, so can it due to caused by malignant hyperthermia? Because we don't know, so we have to do tests or we do genetic tests from the muscle. So it's this one, the first question. My second question is, you say you showed the experiment using rat with endotoxemia during exercise. So then they use dexamethasone to prevent the hyperthermia or maybe hypothermia because it's like a septic shock. So can we use infliximab like TNF alpha inhibitor? So if we know the athlete will get the endotoxemia during exercise, can we give them infliximab as a inhibitor for the increase of inflammation during the exercise? Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Dr. Titin.
Thank you.
So just to answer the first question, malignant hyperthermia has got a very different mechanism, like you correctly point out. It's a response to halothane, and the mechanism is that it's genetically, it's due to genetics, where in that response, what happens is that it induces the sarcoplasmic reticulum in the muscle, even though the person is anesthetized. The sarcoplasmic reticulum in the muscle is activated and it releases a lot of calcium. As a result of that, your muscles are contracted. Right? And because your muscles are contracted, it produces a lot of heat. And this is how you get an increase in body temperature that leads to damaging of the muscle cells, actually. Now, it has been shown, what you just mentioned about malignant hyperthermia in military people was a topic of discussion quite long ago, and it's been shown that it's dissociated in military personnel. In other words, most of in the cases that are happening in the military or even community or in labor force is due to exertional heat stroke, independent of the malignant hyperthermia. So that's the first case. The second one, you're right. Not just dexamethasone, other studies that uses antibiotics, that uses aspirin, anything that blocks endotoxemia, anything that are anti-inflammatory has the same effect. They protect the animal 100%. I think it becomes an issue of cost and benefit because, these drugs do have their side effects.
Yes.
And
it's quite big.
Yeah, whether and their use as a prophylaxis needs to be looked at from that perspective. So far, I know because, like I said, a lot of schools are still teaching the hyperthermia theory and not looking at the endotoxemia theory. Nobody has looked into using all this as prophylaxis yet, but there's potential. Definitely not antibiotics because you do end up with resistance. I don't think steroid will be a good candidate because of the other effects of steroid, even for single dose. There may be some case for aspirin also, that are anti-inflammatory, but that becomes a regulatory issue, and the cost and benefit will need to be looked at. Yeah, but in animals, definitely, any of these candidates, they're shown to protect the animals 100% from heat stroke. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Professor. In my last experiment, I used methylene blue to eliminate the effect of endotoxin to blood pressure, to vessel. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I even tried probiotics, a period of probiotics. Yeah, but not very effective. Yeah.
So is there any special bacteria they use for probiotics?
I use there are a few types. I think the quality is very important because those that are not properly manufactured and stored, you find that by the time you take, a lot of the probiotics are already destroyed because the storage is very important for probiotics. And we use 45 billion CFU. That's
it's quite big.
That's the amount that we use for 2 weeks, and we didn't have any effect.
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you so much,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Titin. Yeah.
Thank you.
Very nice
Dr.
answer.
Hadria.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. And then we have another question from Professor Dr. Adrianta from Surabaya.
Dr. Adrianta, hi, how are you?
Surya, Mas Meldi. Okay, thank you.
Hello.
Hello. Nice to see you.
How are you, Prof?
Good. Very happy to see you.
Second lecture.
Thank you. Thank you.
Listening the immune system for stroke and your experiment with steroids, I'm directly thinking of the COVID.
Okay.
The COVID, there is controversy using steroids here. When it reduce inflammation, maybe that's good, but steroids also reduce the immune system.
Yeah.
So that's a play between these two giants.
Yeah.
And it's like why in some patients you succeed giving steroids and one you fail.
Yeah.
And your animal experiments show that steroids, the death rate will sometimes be higher. So this is a nice model actually for our COVID, for hyperthermia and immune system, because you prove that is very important. And we have now known that for COVID, we have really to work on the immune system, not giving the biotics, the immune system. So can you speculate a little bit about your model for trying to understand, because you have the IC in COVID, you have the coagulation things, and all those markers, lab markers, IL-6 and so goes up, the dimer goes up. So I like you to speculate for your nice model. Thank you.
Okay, so two things. One is my use of steroid in my experiment was not meant to be a recommendation for treatment. It was an experimental model to control LPS from crossing the gut and to control inflammation, and to demonstrate that by controlling these two, you can induce heat tolerance at lethal heat load. Now, I know that there are some clinicians who are now promoting the use of dexamethasone as a treatment for COVID. I'm not a clinician myself, but just a general principle. The thing with COVID is quite similar because you're dealing with sepsis as well. And in sepsis, what you get is an overreacting immune system. That's why you get systemic inflammation and so on. And so mechanistically, what you try to do is to suppress the overreaction of the immune system. And that is why there are some places, if you read the literature, some who are promoting the use of dexamethasone as part of the treatment, not really directly at killing the COVID virus, it doesn't do that, but it controls the reaction of the immune system to the COVID virus. Yeah. Just like any sepsis, condition. Yeah. I hope that addresses, that's as much as I can speculate as a non-clinician, yeah, as a physiologist.
Dr. Adrianta, is it okay?
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adrianta. Any else question actually in here? So do I need? I will take. Dr. Lim Pon Hui.
Yes. Hi, Professor Fabian.
Hello, hi, Dr. Lim. Good to see you again.
See you again.
Yeah.
I'm also, so into your talk. I think I love it very much.
Thank you.
Just a question, because since you are talking about LPS, it actually can penetrate, and then is there any indication that we can know that maybe prior to any run or something like that, that we know this person, maybe the LPS level is a bit high? Yeah, is there any indication?
Yeah, you can't tell by that. And that is why the best thing to do, if you're training an athlete, right? Because I did my PhD in exercise immunology. I studied with Laura McKinnon, and she wrote the only textbook on exercise immunology. And I combined exercise immunology and my understanding of heat together, and that's how we developed the model heat stroke. So the best thing to do if you're training athletes, especially during high intensity phase, in periodization when they're reaching the peak, you should do an immunology lock, LOG. They should lock their immune status almost on a 24-hour, 48-hour basis. Every morning they log, do I have sore throat? Do I have blocked nose? Do I have, any kind of disturbances on my intestines or so? There is a standard form that's available. You can search for that, for under athletes monitoring, immune system monitoring of athletes. And it's just a checkbox. You can do that in 1-2 minutes, quite fast. So every 48, 72 hours, during periods of intense training, they can tick those things. And from there, you can see whether someone developing symptoms or not. The best way to do that, that's the closest you can do, is by logging the immune responses and things like that, early symptoms. And once you pick up early symptoms, the best things for a clinician to determine is to separate whether is it an allergy or an infection. Because some people have chronic allergy, and you shouldn't, because of that, they stop training. There's a difference between a cold and an infection. So the difference is this: in In a cold, the symptoms are above the neck. In an infection, the symptoms are below the neck. That's one way to differentiate that. You know, you get fever all over, you get body ache, you get other kind of symptoms, you get URTI, sore throat, and so on. So separating those two is quite important. And working with a clinician to be able to, your team doctor, to be able to separate those two are important, because you don't want also to overreact in that some athletes can actually train because it's not really an infection, just a normal sinus that they normally have that can be managed really with anti-allergy drugs and so on.
So it means like a butterfly in the stomach is not a good indicator or something like that.
Well, those are acute, those are immediate. But if you constantly have that, those people who are, if you're sports psychologists, right?
Yep.
What are the intestinal prolonged stress symptoms? You start with getting stomach cramps.
Yeah.
You lose appetite.
Yeah.
The very worst case, you feel nauseous. You feel like you want to throw out.
Yeah.
You're hungry, but you cannot eat.
Yeah.
Those are all the reaction, the stress response of your gastrointestinal system, even to mental stress.
Definitely.
Yeah. And when that happens, even at rest, the permeability of the intestine is open up. So the fire for heat stroke starts in the intestine. That's what we say.
All right, with that, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fabian.
Thank you, Dr. Limpon Hoy. Okay, the time I think is already 5 to 10. So, do you mind if any one more question?
Yeah, we can take a few more. It's okay.
Okay. So, wait. This one. Okay, this is from. Wait a minute. I'm looking. I think this is already. Maybe the other one asking directly before I'm looking for the good one related with your question.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe anyone want asking directly, you can raise your hand and open your microphone. Okay, please. Okay, Mr. Faisal, you wanna have a question? Okay.
No, it's very good. I'm very happy to attend, and Dr. Fabian explained very well. I'm very happy to join it. Dr. Limbon, who asked very good questions. It's very informative session, and I congratulate all the whole organizing committee, especially Dr. Fabian as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I think, is it okay if I take this opportunity to make a small announcement about the Asian College of Exercise and Sports Science?
Yes, okay, please.
Yeah. So I just want to let you know that since February, we started the Asian College of Exercise and Sports Science. We've been working on this for 3 years. There are 7 countries or territories that are now involved. And it's meant to open up to all Asian countries, 45, 46 Asian countries under the Asian Olympic Council, or Olympic Council Asia, OCA. And we'll be opening up for membership very soon. We just did a change on the membership fee to bring it down drastically so that students, faculty, and all will be affordable to everyone. I hope that all of you will participate when we open up for membership. Yeah. That's called the ACESS, Asian College of Exercise and Sports Science. Yeah. It's meant to bring all the exercise and sports science practitioners together in Asia. Yeah. Okay. I'll take question. Yeah.
Question?
Can I have more questions?
Yes.
More questions, yes.
Please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Lin. Yeah, thank you, Prof. Fabian. Yeah, it's very nice talk, and I think very informative. Your answer is very very informative, yeah, and very useful for me, yeah, for my next study. Yeah.
Thank
so a long time ago, when Indonesian, I think I forgot, maybe Olympiad team, I think, yeah, when it was held in China. So it was during not winter, I think before winter or after winter. So the weather is quite cold. So Indonesian team came to Beijing 3 months before the event. They said that it's for adaptation with the weather, but the result is not. It was not so good. So my question is, how long time for adaptation? Not only for cold, but also for heat. For example, if we go to Arabic country, that the weather, the temperature is quite extreme. So how long the best time to get adaptation for our athletes? Thank you, Professor.
Thank you for the question. This brings me back when I was executive director of the Singapore Sports Institute, where I was in charge of the London Olympic campaign. So I set up the Singapore Sports Institute in 2011 and ran it as the executive director for 3 years, where we were in charge of all the Team Singapore athletes and international games. For adaptation to an overseas condition, it's not just to the weather, but to the clock as well, to the circadian rhythm as well.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're traveling to somewhere where the time clock is different, say to Europe, to America, you need to also think about the time it takes for the body to adjust to the circadian rhythm. Usually about 2 weeks is enough.
2 weeks.
Yeah. Okay. So for heat, as I said in my first part of today's talk, for heat or cold, it's about 10 to 14 days. If you're there every day training, for circadian rhythm adjustments, usually it's about 1 week, 1 to 2 weeks is enough. So that's what we did as well. We actually brought the whole team, put ourselves in London about two weeks before that to get used to the weather, to get used to the circadian clock before the athletes move into the athletes' village. Yeah.
So how about the clothing, Professor? It's better we use for example, in the cold we use the thick cloth, or we just plain clothes to adapt with the environment?
Oh no, so same thing. You have to wear sufficient clothing. So thick clothes when it's cold. You have to wear sufficient clothing to maintain your core temperature at a level, at your normal level. Because when your core temperature drops too much, your body immune system is suppressed as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
or
thick clothing. Yeah.
Or we can use gradual. I mean, the first day when we come, we use the thick clothes, but maybe next 3 day or 4 day we use the more thinner clothes, maybe.
Yeah, based on the tolerance of the athlete. So you cannot dictate, like after 2 days you remove 1 layer, after 2 days you remove 1 layer. As the athlete become more tolerant, then you remove it. You got to test it by tolerance rather than by time. Okay. The response of the body, that's more important.
Okay. Can we force the athlete to adjust themselves to the environment? Because they said that no pain, no gain.
Yeah, but the problem with that, if you expose it too quickly, you can cause the body to overreact and go into the other extreme as well. So like if you're going to somewhere that is hot, it's good to do heat acclimatization here first. If you're going to somewhere that's cold, you can also do cold acclimatization in your own country first. So one of the things to do is to soak themselves in ice water. Yeah. So starting with 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and things like that. So you can control the temperature of the water is even better. Something like cold spa and hot spa is the same concept. Yeah. So those are the things. Yeah.
So it's better we do adaptation before we go to that country.
Yeah. Okay. You don't have to adapt only when you're there. You can start adapting here and then complete the adaptation when you're there.
Okay, Professor. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Professor. Very nice. answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Dr.
Hardian.
Titin. Yeah.
Thank you. This is have any question related with Dr. Hardian question from Dr. Ermita Ilyas Ibrahim. She is the coach, the national team coach in athletic.
Okay.
Please welcome Dr. Ermita.
Yeah, and Indonesia always does very well.
Yeah. Dr.
Sorry.
Ermita,
Thank you very much, Dr. Titin.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you, Prof. Fabian.
Very nice to meet you.
Actually, I'm not a coach.
Okay.
I'm a medical doctor.
Okay. Yeah, you're the coach of the coach.
Yeah, I was about 30 years in Athletic Association, and I'm also the members of Athletic Asian Association a medical commission until now. Yeah,
okay,
long time already.
Yeah,
actually, yeah, I got a lot of information from your presentation. Thank you very much. I would like to continue Dr. Professor Hardian questions that he asked about the acclimatization. Now I want to ask about the acclimation. Is that the adaptation before going to some country that different? I think you know that.
Yes.
Could you give us the how to do that, or and how long that we can get the adaptation for that?
Okay. So if you are assuming, like in our region, usually in the day, it goes up to about 35 degrees. Would that be the same as in your country? 33, 35 degrees in the afternoon?
34, yeah.
Yeah, around there. So so if you're going to a place that's maybe 35, 36 degrees to compete, it's good to do about 2 weeks of heat acclimatization in your own country first. And that involves, like I said earlier, from the 2 weeks, starting maybe about half an hour, building up to about one plus hour of training in the heat. So in the first, let's say it's a 10 days program. The first 5 days is heat adaptation. So the first 5 days, right, you're just gradually increasing the duration, but the intensity is moderate. And then the second 5 days, you're maintaining duration, but the intensity can be increased gradually. Yeah. So it takes about 10 days of daily exposure, training in the heat, starting about half an hour, building up to about 1.5 hours. And so once you have done that already, every week you should still have one or two sessions to maintain the adaptation. Right. So then you travel to the other country. You are semi-adapted to let's say 36 degrees, 37 degrees. And you need another maybe about 6 days, 8 days over there, if possible.
How about if we are going to the coolest?
So cool, if you're going to cooler country, if it's cool, you already have an advantage. If you can perform in the heat, you will perform better in the cool. When I say cool, I mean maybe about 10 to 15 degrees. Right?
Not very cold.
Yeah, not very cold, but colder than us, but not extremely cold. So you're already at an advantage. So when you're there, you just need to get used to it, more of a psychological thing, to be comfortable training, running in that condition. 4 or 5 days is good enough. It's a mental adaptation more than a physiological adaptation. But if you're going to cold, when I say cold, I mean maybe
cold.
6 degrees, 8 degrees or so. You can start to acclimatize in Indonesia using cold water.
Yeah,
using cold water. And this is how people does it. So you have cold water, like in the ice bath, you start to soak themselves in the ice bath, to get the body used to, starting with 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Cold is harder to adjust. And then extending it to a slightly longer period of time, gradually. Yeah. And then, so once you've done that, you just need about 4 or 5 days in the cold country to get used to the weather itself. And again, for that period, it's mental adaptation more than physiological adaptation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I when I was in Australia about 20 years ago, more than
Yes.
20 years ago.
Okay.
In Canberra, they have one big hall for acclimation. Yeah, this is in the Western country or in the
Yes.
rich country. They can make it.
Yeah. I think you said the Australian Institute of Sports.
Yes, right.
Correct. Yeah.
Part
of my PhD was done. One of my PhD study was done there. But there are other ways to do it without having to spend expensive equipment.
Yeah.
So like I said, some people do heat acclimatization in an environmental chamber that costs $1 million, $300,000.
Very expensive.
But in Asia, there's no need to. You can use the natural weather.
Yeah, that's good idea using the bath.
Yes,
bath.
using the bath. So like I showed you earlier in the firefighter study I'm doing now, I'm actually using the outdoor environment to do heat acclimatization. Yeah. So it's possible without having to spend so much money.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Elmita. Thank you, Professor Fabian Lim. So I think it's enough. Any question again? Okay, I think the time is going to 5:25. So this very interesting topic, and so many people interested with this topic. I think next will be the next session about dehydration.
Yeah,
we can talk about water the next time.
Yeah.
You keep him for a long time.
We'll keep it.
But it's okay. Very good. Very
Thank
good.
you. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Elmita. Maybe next time Dr. Elmita will be the next visiting lecture for athlete.
Yes.
Okay, so before we are finished, Professor Setio Rahayu, are you there?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so maybe would say some closing statement.
Okay, for closing this event, I would like to thank you very much for Professor Fabian Lim.
Thank you.
For the awesome and great lecturing. Yeah, and this topic is very interesting. For appreciation, we will give a guest lecture certificate to Professor Fabian Lim. Yeah, wait a moment, I will share screen the certificate. Okay.
Thank you very much.
This certificate for Associate Professor Fabian Chin Leong Lim, PhD. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. And I'm very happy to be able to share information with everyone. I hope it's useful with you. And I wish all of you again good health and happiness and peace. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, and see you next time. Thank you for all of participants from UNES, Undip, UI, UNER, Unimed, Unpati, UNESA, Gorontalo, Cirebon, Malaysia, Pakistan, Taiwan, and other. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank
you. See you next time.
Yeah.
Okay, back to moderator, Bu Titin.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Setio Rahayu. Now maybe we can take picture together. The last, we still stand in here this lecture for 3 hours. Mr. Melody, could you have to taking picture together? Yeah, that's good. This is have Mr. Haritanu. It's like, Mr. Haritanu.
The rich man.
Oh yeah, there is man.
It's man.
Okay,
Do
taking
not
picture
from
together.
friend.
Sakit, Mr. Melody? Please open your camera, please, so we can take picture together. Because in here, always off the camera. Only the old people on the camera. How about the young people? They don't want to open the camera. I don't know what happened.
We
They
are
are so
still young,
shy.
Dr. Titin. We are still young.
Oh yeah. I'm sorry.
No one old.
Still young.
Just the
Yeah.
experience old.
Still 17. Okay, taking picture together. Please open your camera. Oh, thank you. In here we have excellent people from exercise physiology from Physiology Society Indonesia. Have Dr. Hadian, Dr. Emita Ilyas, Dr. Adrianta, Dr. Sukiharto, Dr. Setio Rahayu, Dr. Agus usually have in here, and Dr. Tri Restiadi in here. What happened with Zeta? Okay, so taking picture together. 1, 2, Santis. Yeah, that's good. Buncis. One more. Second one. Okay. 56, 59. Already all? 59? Already all. Centema. Center. Okay, second. We have a 3. Oh, this is no people open the camera. The second face. How about the third? No, open the camera also. Oh, what happened? Okay, thank you very much for all participants for Indonesia and also from other country, Malaysia, Pakistan. Thank you very much. And we hope we can have learned so much from
There is
this.
one request, Miss Dr. Sherry, from my side. Kindly inform me about all upcoming future events so that I can attend all of them. Impressive and all very informative session that you are going to moderate. It's awesome. And I'm a knowledge seeker and always learn and ready to attend all these webinars. So kindly engage me in all your upcoming webinars, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Faisal Faz. Thank you very much. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank
See you
you.
next time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Assalamualaikum
Professor.
warahmatullahi
Yeah.
wabarakatuh. Thank you.
Thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you, Bu
Thank you.
Titin.
Yeah.
Matur suwun.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ernita. Thank you, Dr. Titin. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Yeah. Yeah. See you in
See
next
you.
meeting. Yeah. See you.
Yes, see you next meeting.
Thank you, Bu Dr. Setio Rahayu.
Terima kasih.
Thank you. Terima
Dr.
kasih.
Fabian.
Thank you very much.
Terima kasih atas partisipasinya. Izinkan saya menutup sesinya.